Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to the very first Breaking into Social Impact virtual meetup of 2021. Very excited to be here yet again to talk about social impact and learn about how professionals are actually getting into the profession in hopes that they can help you get questions answered and all that good stuff. So, by way of introduction, my name is Jeremy Brown. I'm the founder of Startups Give Back. And essentially, Startups Give Back helps companies give back to the community by organizing volunteering events and partnering with nonprofits. And so happy to be here, like I said. So, with that, I want to turn it over to the panelists to talk a little bit about their backgrounds and who they are and where they work. So, we'll start off with Rachel.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel. As Jeremy mentioned, I'm on Uber's social impact team based in San Francisco, and super excited to chat today, to hear more about London's experience, and just to share this experience. So thanks for joining.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is London. Unfortunately, I'm not in London right now. I am based in San Francisco. I work on Twitter social impact team, which sits under our global public policy team. Really excited to be talking with you all, sharing more about the impact space. And yeah, just thank you for your time.
And just to give a little context around how this meetup is going to work. So we have about 20, 30 minutes of moderated Q&A, and then we want to kick it over to all of you to get your questions answered. So we want to spend a lot of time on your questions. That's where the real value is going to come in at. And so that's how it's going to go. So with that, we'll start with the very first question here. I want to learn a little bit more about the why behind each individual and how they got into social impact and why. So London, let's start with you. As a social impact professional, why was this profession so interesting to you and why did it resonate?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's always important to remember the why. I'll share just like about my background and tie into kind of why I entered this space. But I've always been interested in the idea of social impact and the notion of like we enter this world, let's leave it better than when we found it. And so always been fascinated by this concept, whether it was through nonprofit work or a for-profit work. Growing up, I actually had lucky enough to have a mentor who led social impact at Expedia, and she introduced me to the concept of social impact in the private sector and the power of using business to create social change. So that actually led to studies in business and international development, and ultimately my interest in CSR. So fast forward to 2017, I had just completed a fellowship at a nonprofit called Kiva, which is a global micro finance nonprofit, and was looking for more long-term opportunities in social impact, specifically in the private sector. So applied to tons and tons of roles, got tons and tons of rejections, but finally found a contract role, actually a year-long contract role at Twitter, supporting program and operations at their community space called the Twitter Neighbor Nest, which is still one of their flagship programs in San Francisco. And so, yeah, that's kind of the beginning of my journey at Twitter and social impact. I've been at Twitter for almost 4 years now, and I support the head of philanthropy and social impact, and work across all of our global social impact programs. In terms of the why, yeah, always just been fascinated by the space and like the intersection of business and social good. And I think while CSR is definitely more of a mainstream trend these days, I think there's still an incredible need for businesses to understand the relationship with society and understand the relationship with stakeholders, whether that's their customers, their communities, their natural environment, and to act on that through intentional social impact programs. And I think it's key to building a more sustainable and inclusive economy. So yeah, it's a little bit more about me and kind of why I joined the space.
Rachel, over to you.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I think my background is a little bit different than London. I don't actually have a formal training in social impact. I think when I started my career, I probably didn't know what social impact was. When I started my career, I won't tell you how long ago, I really wanted to work in government. I was a public affairs major in college and really thought that I wanted to work for a member of Congress. So I kind of started my career working for the governor. I'm from Minnesota, so working from the governor of Minnesota at the time, and then Senator Al Franken. And really, I was kind of all about public service. I think that what I found, the beauty that I found in politics is kind of giving a voice to the voiceless. And so that was kind of a driving factor for me initially. I think that is still like a thread that I weave throughout my work, but I think I've arrived at social impact at Uber a bit differently. Honestly, I think it was a lot of luck, a lot of timing, and a lot of taking advantage of opportunities. So really, like, the transfer that I made is I was in Minnesota looking for jobs in DC, and I had a friend who had a job at Google, and she was like, "Hey, I really think you should apply for this job." And I was kind of like, "Oh, I never saw myself in San Francisco. I never saw myself even working in tech." And then I got the job, and it felt like an opportunity I couldn't pass up. So kind of moved out to San Francisco, and that kind of like changed my trajectory. And then I think in my experience at Google, I saw different opportunities. I mean, Google is like one of my role models when I think of social impact. I think google.org is amazing and really is doing so much good in the world. And so I think that was kind of my first intro to social impact, where I just learned a little bit more about what Google was trying to do. And then I think I took that lesson with me kind of when I was hopping around from different tech companies and landed at Uber about 5 years ago. And when I started at the company, there was not a social impact, there wasn't like a formalized, centralized social impact team. And so I feel like I had learnings, a bunch of random learnings from a bunch of different experiences in government and different companies that I thought I could kind of take advantage of and bring to Uber.
So Rachel, you mentioned google.org. For those that may not be familiar with Google's .org program and team, can you give a little bit of background on that, and also why why it is a role model for social impact for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not on the. I don't probably know enough to give detail on what google.org does. I just know that they basically have their structure is a little bit different. They have a foundation. Google.org is its own foundation, and so I think they have a bit more I mean, this is my understanding. They have a bit more flexibility to do many different things and be pretty comprehensive in their programs because they actually have a nonprofit, a .org, basically, that they're working out of. And so I think because of that, again, it gives them a bit more freedom to do what they want and to like do things that they really believe in. Whereas I think when you're at a company like Uber, and I'm not sure how Twitter is set up, it's just a different structure because we are a corporation. And so when we make donations, there's a lot of kind of hoops that we have to jump through. And I think it just is a little bit different. That being said, not knowing the ins and outs of how google.org works, I just think that they've really taken advantage of being such a successful company. And it's kind of ingrained in the DNA of when you are a Googler to like, you're encouraged to give back. And a lot of the benefits around even matching the dollars that you give, I think it's like, that's what I'm kind of saying. It's like really ingrained in the employee experience. But then I also think it's again, this is from my brief experience, I think the founders, CEOs, like it's important to the leaders of the company as well. So I think that's just where there's a lot of opportunity for other companies to learn from companies like Google.
Absolutely. So now one question that I like to ask whenever I have this event, because there's a lot of ways to describe doing good as a business. We have CSR, we have corporate philanthropy, we have social impact. So as it relates to social impact, how do you define social impact? Lyndon, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned all those different terms. So I think there's so many terms out there, and most of the times they're pretty synonymous. But in my mind, social impact is really like any effort to create public value for society, and ideally in a way that is sustainable and innovative and systematic. But I think it can be achieved through many different avenues, whether you are a nonprofit, whether you are a for-profit, or even the hybrid, right? There are so many different models of social enterprise, which I think is really exciting about the impact space. But At Twitter, I think we look at social impact not only through the lens of philanthropy and volunteerism, but we also look at it as a broader relationship to other parts of the company, such as our inclusion and diversity team, our product teams, and our real estate and workplace and sustainability teams. So it's a really holistic and integrated approach to doing good with resources across your company, not just within one team.
Rachel, how about you?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one big piece of honestly what my job has been is educating employees internally at Uber as to what social impact is. It's truly not just check writing, and I think a lot of people think that that's all we do. It's like pure philanthropy. Like, can you just write a check and help X, Y, and Z by giving money? I think Uber is not in the space where we have a lot of checks that we can write. We are not a profitable company, and there are so many companies out there that can't do that. And so I think, sorry, that's my roommate, my dog Teddy. I think, sorry, he's just excited. Someone's at the door. I think really where social impact is so impactful is when you look at the product or what the company is actually doing. So I think it's almost like thinking of in kind, like what is the unique spot that your company can offer? And I think for Uber, it's a pretty obvious answer. Like we move people from point A to B, we move food to people, right? So I think it's how can we help move people who need more access to transportation? How can we help feed people who are isolated and can't go out to get food? And so I think that's really where for us at Uber, social impact is important, is thinking about the shared value. And it's truly getting a bit creative also, right? Because we don't have a lot of money to give, but we know that we have a role to play, and how do we figure that out? I also think the other side of it is that it's good for business. I think, a lot of the research shows that millennials and Gen Z look for brands that are socially conscious. And so I think that's also a really big piece of what we look to as well, is like, this is the right thing to do. And so we're doing it for that reason, but it's also good for business, because if it's good for business, that's the only way it's going to be like long-term sustainable.
So you mentioned educating employees, and this is inevitably going to be something that someone's going to have to do if there is no social impact program in their company and they want to start something. How did you go about educating the employees in Uber around what social impact is and what it means to the business?
Yeah, so it's definitely been an evolution for us. And it's kind of like, you should think about where is your first easy win and what is some low hanging fruit, because you're going to have to make a case for why it's important for like most circumstances. And so I think specifically at Uber, so I've been at Uber about 5 years, so probably about like a year or two into my experience, I was like, we really need some centralized social impact work here. And what I did see from my perspective is like pockets of employees around the world at Uber volunteering. And so I was like, we should centralize this. Like, we can have a global week of service that's bringing us all together. It's one week that we pick and everyone is encouraged to go out and volunteer. I think that was also for us a big moment. Like it happened within Uber's history in about 2017, which was a pretty tough year for Uber. And so I think employees were also looking for a rallying cry, and employee morale was a bit lower. And so from there, we kind of built this employee volunteering program. At the time, I was sitting on HR, so it did make sense because that kind of fell within employee benefits. But since then, it has evolved. So we kind of, that program took off. People were really excited about it. And then we're like, okay, so we have this. What can we build on top of it? And then at the same time that we had that momentum, my team moved over to the policy side. So then we started to think about how can we bring social impact into the policy work that we were doing. And then more recently, about a year ago, we moved to the marketing side. So it's like definitely evolved, I think, with the teams that we sit on. And I think that that's pretty common. London, I don't know about your experience, but I think like hopping around from team to team, depending on timing, again, it seems to be pretty common.
Yeah, I mean, I surprisingly have been under public policy for all 4 years, but I feel like it is common for folks to move around. I would say it's very natural for social impact programs to grow and evolve based on how the company is doing in the world, based on what's happening politically in the world, right? Um, as many of you know, like Twitter has had its ups and downs in the last 5 to 6 years. When I joined in 2017, our program was relatively small, and it was primarily focused in San Francisco because that's where we were founded. And so we were focused on a lot of the traditional philanthropic and employee volunteerism work, data service and writing grants, which are great. But like as the company has grown and also as the company has become more decentralized, which is something that Jack talks a lot about as the future of work, we've had to think about like how do we grow our program not only geographically and invest in more markets outside of San Francisco, but also how do we get really innovative with Rachel, what you mentioned, like the superpower of your company, which for us is our service and our platform, which can be incredibly powerful, as we all know, to amplify voices. And so that's something that we're thinking about as we grow this program. Like, how do we really tap into that power and like harness the service for social impact? And I think that's definitely a trend across the whole social impact space of companies trying to figure out like what can they offer that other companies can't, like how can they do social impact in a way that's very unique to their business and creates value for their business while also serving the community. So yeah, Rachel, so many of those things also resonate with my experience as well.
So that's a good segue into what social impact actually looks like at your company. So Lyndon, let's stay with you. What does Twitter's social impact program look like?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we view it in a very holistic way. I think of kind of four main spheres that make up social impact. So it's philanthropy and volunteerism, how we use our product for good, environmental sustainability, and then inclusion and diversity efforts, which affect a lot of our workforce development programs. So I actually spend most of my time on philanthropy and volunteerism and the product side. So when we think about those areas, we think about how do we harness our resources across the company from our people, so our employees around the world, to our platform and our service, to our profits, like our corporate giving resources. And so we still provide financial grants to organizations because that's still a need in the community. We provide in-kind donations in the form of IT equipment. We train nonprofits on how to use Twitter and how to amplify their work on our service, and also provide ad credits, so free advertising credits, and then product donations to organizations to spark conversation around causes that are important to us and important to the world. And then lastly, leveraging the skills and the time of employees through days of services, through Hack Week. We have Hack for Good, through employee giving and donation matching. So that's kind of what it looks like at a high level. I'm happy to go into any specifics.
Let's kick it over to Rachel.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think our program has definitely evolved, as I mentioned before. I also think COVID completely blew everything out of the water for my team, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, it definitely changed the world as we know it, right? But it also really changed the nature of my team's work. I think that in March, or maybe I should say in January, January of last year, if you would have asked me this question, I would have had a very different answer. I think right now we are still figuring out exactly what our program looks like. I will say that we have kind of key pillars that we focus on, which Lyndon mentioned, like you guys have your pillars as well. I think that's pretty common. And I think for us, what we've been really trying to focus on this year is thinking about what are the 3 pillars that we think will still be relevant for Uber in 2 years and in 5 years, knowing that hopefully another pandemic doesn't happen, but the world is changing very fast and it could. And so how can we think about what is the longer term kind of plan for social impact at Uber? And so really we've kind of landed on 3 pillars that we focus on. And then within each pillar, we have kind of room to build out different programs and partnerships. And so the three pillars that we have are earners on the Uber's platform. So that's an Uber driver, that's a person who delivers your food, that's a freight driver, that's a restaurant. So that kind of all is under the earners platform or pillar. We have small businesses and we have communities. And so then it's really looking at those are our audiences that we're trying to serve. So those are the three groups that we are always going to serve. I think I saw a question come through around how do you prioritize? That's our first attempt at prioritizing. Those are very big buckets. Like, how do you define community? That's a great question. Like, we are still trying to figure that out, right? But I think that that's like, if we have kind of the line in the sand of like, these at least are the like pillars that we want to work with, then within that we can build out our programs. And I think for us, the big piece that we think we can have value is looking at large national or global NGOs that could help partner with us, because we don't want to ever claim to say that we are the experts in this space. Like, we need the experts to help us. And it's definitely partnerships and programs that we will co-build with nonprofits. And so I think a big part of it is like finding the sweet spot of which are the right nonprofits to kind of fill the three categories that we have.
So inevitably there's going to be attendees on here that are interested in getting into the profession, and we know it's a very competitive profession to get into. In London, I know you had a very unique way of actually landing at Twitter. You went through a kind of a different route than traditionally that people would look to get into the profession. So I would love to kind of double click on that and how you got into the profession at Twitter. So start with you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I get it a lot, and it's hard because I don't always have like the step-by-step recipe for success on how to get into social impact, because as you said, it is competitive, and there aren't a ton of jobs. But I can talk about my experience, and hopefully it's somewhat helpful. But yeah, I entered through a contract role, which I definitely want to acknowledge. It requires a certain level of privilege to be able to take on a contract role. But I knew I was really passionate about the space and wanted to get just any experience. So I kind of took a leap of faith and said, hey, I'm going to do this for a year and work really hard, learn as much as I can, build connections within the company, and see where it goes. So having a contract role was challenging at times, but it was also a great foot in the door and a great opportunity for exposure. So I would say, as you're looking for jobs, keep an open mind, cast a wide net, and don't rule out opportunities like contract roles to get hands-on experience if you really know you want to be in this space. So yeah, that's a little bit more about my experience.
And on the other side of the coin, there will likely be a number of attendees who happen to work at a tech company, for example, and they want to transition into social impact. Now, Rachel, you created the social impact program from scratch at Uber. What steps did you take to get that started?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely cannot take credit for starting social impact at Uber. I had a colleague who was leading it with me as well, who became kind of my boss at the time. So I think having someone there who was more experienced than me, who also saw the importance of making it happen, was very important. And so I think having an ally who really understands and being aligned on how you can make the case to leadership was important. But yeah, I mean, I think the beauty of working at a tech company, and in my experience, kind of compared to working for the federal government, is that tech is constantly changing and moving. Like, arguably, you could say that the lack of structure is a hard part of my. I would say that's a hard part of my job, but it's also how I got my job, because things are so fluid. And so I think if you look at probably more startups or smaller companies, there's so much opportunity to see a void and create a program. And I think that's really, I was really lucky. Again, I do think it was part timing for me, but I think that working in tech, I feel like those opportunities are everywhere, and you can kind of make a case for almost anything. And I feel like because it's a tech company, many executives and folks within the company are kind of open to that. Like, the entrepreneurial spirit is really applauded.
Now, knowing what you know now throughout your careers, if you had to go back and create a program from scratch all over again, where would you start? What would be the first couple of things that you would do to get that kicked off? Let's go over to you first.
That's a hard question.
Yeah, that's a hard question. You're really throwing us some hard ones right away.
No. Things I would have done if I had to start from scratch, Jeremy?
Yeah. So if you're creating a program from scratch, where would you start? Like, how would you create the foundation for the actual program to then obviously grow?
Yeah. So like the building blocks. Yeah. Really, really great question. I think some important things to think about are accountability. I think this is huge because I think it's a really important part of making progress and being transparent, which I think helps build trust, like externally and also internally. So I think having clear frameworks for accountability, whether that is leading up to your executive leadership or even your board leadership, I think having that really clear line of command when it comes to social impact, I think is a really important building block to a good program. I also think of integration in the terms of having goals that align with your company's goals and your company's mission so that you can really be clear on the business value you're creating in addition to the community value, but also integration in terms of like employee engagement. So for example, at Twitter, we've recently launched, or within the past 2 years, launched a program called Good for Twitter, where employees can essentially create their own social impact goals in Workday and as part of their performance review. So it's a great way for employees to stay accountable to how they want to contribute to the community. So I think that's really important. It's something I would have liked to see early on at Twitter. I also think strong leadership buy-in is really key. This is something I'm super grateful to have at Twitter. Our co-founder jokes that he hired the first social impact lead before the sales lead. I don't know if it's really true, but I think having strong buy-in from the board level and the executive level is key because they set the tone for the company and the culture, and also enable employees themselves to feel empowered and feel that they can kind of build something from the bottom up. So I think those key things are important and something I would have loved to seen, right when Twitter started its social impact program.
Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would argue that it's a flawed question because the nature of social impact is it's constantly changing because for me at least, this is my experience, it constantly changes with the company. So it's almost like you have to look where the business is going. And many times in tech, you don't know, like I don't know what Uber is going to look like in a year. I have some guesses, but I actually don't know. And Twitter too, right? Like it will look a lot different. And so I think it's hard to build a foundation like for the actual program when you don't actually know what is the product roadmap for the next year, what is the business road, like what are the plans. I think that they're like some of the things that London said you definitely need leadership buy-in, you need the board to care. You honestly, I think you just need one executive champion who's like C-suite and can lead things. But I think beyond that, it's actually probably a detriment to you to do too much planning because it will change, and that was then a big waste of your time for planning for something that like took a left turn.
I'll also add a +1 to that. I think changes in the company and changes in the world can actually spark a lot of creativity, innovation, and make you change course in a way that benefits your program in the long term. And so like Rachel said, you can always plan for it in the beginning, right? Especially Twitter, like we say that Twitter is what's happening. And that changes every single day because there's so much happening in the world. And so the political climate, the environment around us shapes our program each and every day, and we have to be able to be responsive to those things.
All right, last question before we kick it over to the attendees. So, what are some resources that you regularly read, watch, listen to stay on top of the social impact profession? Rachel, if you want to go first.
Sure. Yeah. Um, I mean, I think based on this conversation, we haven't even really been able to define social impact, right? Like, I think it really does look different for every company and every person. And so I think in terms of how to stay on top of the social impact profession, I don't think there's any one resource that's great or isn't great. I think it's very personal. And for me, I guess I can answer. I think what I do to get inspired is I have a list of 10 to 20 brands that I think are doing amazing things in the world. And then what I do is I Google the brand and see what are they doing from a social impact perspective? What have they launched? What does their website look like? Is it engaging? As a consumer, do I like it? And so I think that's what is actually more helpful for me is learning kind of best practices from some of those other companies and hoping it kind of sparks some creativity in me to say, oh, is that something we could do at Uber, or how would that look if I took a version of that or something like that. So I think it's truly just kind of like looking at other brands and kind of learning from them.
Yeah, I agree with Rachel. It's hard to pinpoint kind of one resource to stay on top of social impact. I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. For me, I personally love conferences, though. I know that sometimes they're not always the most accessible, although some do have scholarships and discounts for students. But I love BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, as well as SOCAP, Social Capital Markets. So if you're able to attend a conference, highly recommend those two. I know there's also so much information online these days about CSR on edX, Udemy, probably General Assembly too. So that's a potential resource. I just completed a social impact strategy course actually with the University of Pennsylvania, and would really recommend that if folks are interested in a really deep dive into social impact strategy. And it's also relatively affordable as well. And then I also just try to stay on top of newsletters from nonprofits and local and national news, just to keep a pulse on like what's happening out in the world. I think the more I can stay connected to what's happening in the community, the better I can be at my job. So, yeah.
As a quick reminder, if you have a question, please use the Q&A link. And so now we're going to go over to attendee questions. So this one is specifically for Rachel, but London, feel free to chime in. Question is, I'm currently building out social impact at my org and interested in learning about Uber community programs. How do you effectively work with brand marketing and community outreach / engagement teams to create and operate those programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I'm currently working on myself. So I definitely don't have the perfect answer for this. I think it's kind of in line to what I was saying before of if you look at where the company is moving towards, the brand marketing team is already working on that, I think for sure. And so it's almost like the momentum is with marketing. So it's like figure out how you can kind of get on that like on that ride, I guess. In terms of like community outreach and engagement team. So that I would say that's more of what like my team does, or that would be more of like the social impact role at Uber now. And so I think it's like sitting down and understanding what the team that you want to work with, whether it's brand marketing or anyone else, like what are their priorities? And then it's how does that match up with yours? And how do you figure out a way to bring the two together? I think there's always a solution. It's just figuring out what it is, and it might take some time. But I think that it's like, again, kind of looking at what's the direction of the business, and then just like taking some time to get creative and think outside the box together.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I would agree with Rachel. I would also say there's such a tremendous opportunity for brand marketing, right? Especially as Rachel mentioned, like customers want to support socially conscious businesses, right? And so I think there's huge opportunity for social impact teams to work closely with brand marketing to make sure it's integrated into how the company talks about itself. markets itself. So yeah.
So this is a question that I get a lot, and this is usually from people who work in the nonprofit sector who are looking to get into social impact. What are the transferable skills that you see that a nonprofit individual would have that was actually good for the actual social impact role at a, let's say, a tech company or just a corporation in general?
Do you want me to take this one? Take a first
You
stab.
take the first stab, Rachel.
I mean, I think I kind of referenced this before, but I think the mindset of someone who's worked at a nonprofit is so important. I think it's like, one, bringing us back down to earth because we work in tech and sometimes live in a bubble. I think that's important. I think the second is you have this expertise of working at a nonprofit that potentially folks on the social impact team don't have. And so I think that is invaluable. I think that's really important. It's getting the perspective of a nonprofit, but then kind of understanding how that fits in if you're at the company, like for the for-profit needs of the company. And so I think I have found, like, actually one of my colleagues on my team worked in nonprofits for 10 years, and he's such an important part of our team, because I'm like, oh, how does a nonprofit function? Because I haven't worked at a nonprofit before. And so he like brings in this expertise that I think is hard. It's hard for us to go to a nonprofit if we want them to be a potential partner and not really have a baseline of how the nonprofit works, or kind of like parts of the nonprofit world. And so I think that's really important.
I would agree. I think the community expertise is so key and important. Like I work on the public policy team, and I would probably say 70% of our team has come from the nonprofit sector or come from the government sector, because we really value that industry expertise. So I think that's definitely something to be leveraging when you're looking for roles in social impact. I would also say, like, the resourcefulness of working at a nonprofit. Like, even though Rachel and I both work at tech companies, like, our teams are small, and at least our team is very lean and nimble. And so you often have to be scrappy and resourceful and find innovative ways to build programs with not as many resources as, say, other teams. So I think that resourcefulness and creativity is also something that's transferable.
Okay, next question. This is more of a scenario. You're hiring someone to join your social impact team. Is there one thing you feel like you need to see on someone's resume for a role like that? Who wants to kick it off?
I'm happy to take a stab at it. I won't pinpoint like a specific kind of experience or organization or company, but I would say I think it's really important to have strong relationship building skills, because I feel like so much of our roles are building relationships with the community, with political or government stakeholders, with executives at your company, or even with employees. And so being able to communicate and build relationships and build trust with people all across the aisle, I think is super important. I would also say showing that you can be adaptable and that you can pivot. Tech, and especially Twitter, moves so fast, a million miles per hour. And things are always changing, and decisions are made very quickly, or something happens in the world that directly affects your team and you have to respond. So I think being quick on your feet and being able to adapt easily, I think is super important as well. And I think the more you can show your ability to prioritize, I think is also important. This is something that I struggle with every day, and something that Twitter struggles with, I think, as a company. Like, there's so much happening in the world. Like, how do you figure out what's most important and like critical to your mission and your work, and what's a nice to have? And like, how can you do that on a day-to-day basis, whether it's being able to get through a million things on your to-do list, or figuring out what's most important, or doing at a high level when you're building goals for your team. And so I think, yeah, work experience that shows you can do those things is important. from my perspective.
Yeah, I think I would totally agree with all that you said. I think maybe the two pieces that I would add, the first one is a hard one-liner to add to your resume, but I think many times, as Lyndon, you've kind of mentioned, our social impact teams are always small. At every company, they're always under-resourced and they're always small. And so I think it's like lonely. It can be lonely at times, you know? Like I think and along with that, it's being able to work incredibly independently without structure. I think that that's always going to be how a social impact role will be. So I think it's showing that you're capable of doing that and actually want to do that. I think a lot of people think that they want that, but then as soon as you're in a job with no structure, it can be very challenging. And so I think it's just making sure like that you're weighing and that's kind of important to you and is something that you have. I think the other piece, and this is maybe a bit more specific, is expertise in being able to measure success. I know that that's kind of a question that comes up a lot with social impact, like how do you measure success? And I think that I don't know if I've yet to hear the best answer to that, because I don't think any of us really know. I think it really depends on the goals of your social impact team. And then you can obviously measure success that way. But I think many times it is really hard to know what you should measure and what does success look like. We aren't nonprofits. So it's like, we still work at corporations, right? And so I think the measures of our success are different. And so I think it, to me, would be a really attractive quality to see like data analysis or something that you can kind of bring expertise around how to measure success.
So both Uber and Twitter are two of the most well-known companies on the planet. So inevitably, you probably get inundated with requests from different nonprofits and charitable organizations looking to partner. And so this next question, so from that perspective, what makes a charity or a nonprofit stand out as a good partner? Let's go with Lyndon first.
Yeah, I was thinking about skills to make you successful in this role, which also tie to this question, and it's the ability to say no, because the reality is you can't say yes to everything, and if you do, then what are you really doing, right? And so that's kind of the main reason why we have key strategic like areas of focus. And so we require organizations that we work with to fall within those areas of focus, and those support our company's mission and also support our public policy priorities. So I think it's important for organizations to be strategically aligned so that our partnerships can be more sustainable in the long term. I also think what else we look for. I think when organizations have really strong reporting metrics and are able to measure their success, or at least have clear metrics as to how they're making progress towards that, I think that's also really attractive to us. I also love working with organizations that are comfortable collaborating and comfortable having honest discussions and dialogue about what's possible, right? Oftentimes we approach a partnership not knowing exactly what is possible, but through, I think, dialogue, you can come to some really, really, really neat outcomes in a partnership. And so folks willing to have those conversations and be creative. I'm trying to think. Those are the first few things that come to mind. Rachel, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think many times it's an interesting question, and I think many times nonprofits almost, it's like this like odd dynamic sometimes of like I never want a nonprofit to feel like indebted or they need to say thank you over and over again to Uber for making a donation. Like that's not the type of power dynamic that's helpful, and I think that sometimes that's how, I mean, nonprofits need grants and many times are underfunded and so do need the money. But I also think I don't want to undervalue the expertise that nonprofits bring, as I mentioned earlier, that we need. Like if we're co-building a program, kind of as Lyndon was saying, with a nonprofit, it's like we both need to be at the table and we both need to be kind of creating that together. Again, we have the expertise of, we know what we can do from the Uber perspective. This is the expertise that we bring, this like X, Y, and Z. But then it's like, we need the nonprofit to say, this is what we can bring. And so I think it's the best nonprofits that I've worked with in my experience are ones that are also able to be nimble. I think sometimes nonprofits can be a bit older because they have such rich history in the communities they've served, but I think sometimes that comes along with that is not a nimbleness, and I think that that's kind of what we've been saying, so important with kind of the ever-changing ways that our companies are. That's the unfortunate truth, and I think that sometimes that can be hard to find that, especially for us. I think when we're looking at nonprofit partners, because our team is pretty small, we need to look at partners that are, I mean, global is it's a very hard, it's very hard to find an NGO that's global and fits within our priorities. But then I think it's national. If you're looking at the US, like what is a national nonprofit that we can work with? And so I think it's those things, like the size that kind of matches our size because Uber is so big and global. But then also it's like this nimbleness and capacity to co-build and get creative.
Mhm. And I think I'll also add too is like it also depends on kind of what we're working on together. So say like we're are hoping to launch a campaign on Twitter around suicide prevention. Obviously, we'll look for partners that have more capacity to run these kinds of campaigns on our service, right? And that capacity varies at different nonprofits. Or if we're looking to run a global day of service for all of our employees, we'll look for organizations that have capacity to host and run events with lots of employees. So I think it also depends on the event or the partnership. So just add that as well.
Okay, next question. So it sounds like no 2 days are the same. What would you describe as the main activities you engage with on a regular basis? Is it corp comms plans? Is it engaging in social media? What does a typical day look like for you? Let's start with Rachel.
Yeah. So I think it's looked a lot different during the past year because of the pandemic. I think although my team is small and lean, we're very close. So we actually have a team meeting every morning, which I think is really helpful. Again, that's probably because we can't be in the office together, but I think being able to touch base every morning and talk about what are the priorities for the day is super beneficial and helpful. And just like on a personal level, my team is two of us are here, one is in DC and one is in London. So I think it's just like helpful to bring us all together and to hear about what's happening in their worlds. So that is probably the only consistent thing that we have. And then I think for me, I manage our partnerships in the US. So it's a lot of calls with the external stakeholders that we are building partnerships with. It's a lot of calls internally with teams to, like, whether it's checking in on how our program is going or how are we going to build it together. So it's really kind of a lot of program building, both with internal and external stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree with the notion that my job looks a lot different than it did a year ago. If you asked me the same question last January, I probably would spend a maximum of an hour or 2 hours at my desk because I would be running around either at internal meetings or at community partners or going to events. A lot of it was relationship building. But now that we can't do as much of that, my day to day is definitely a little bit different. Like Rachel, spend time connecting internally with our teams to be aligned. My immediate team is 3.5 people, so we work very closely, and then we also work with our broader U.S. Americas team, and then our global policy team. Spend a lot of time, in calls with different stakeholders, whether that is community partners in the US or employees, et cetera. So yeah, it's hard to say what a typical day looks like because it's different every single day, which I think is one of the most exciting parts of this field. It's so dynamic. But yeah.
How has COVID impacted your ability to create social impact? We've touched on this a little bit, but let's dive into it a little bit more. London, let's actually stay with you for this one.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Obviously, when the pandemic hit, it put a wrench in a lot of our plans, especially around employee engagement, because so much of that was rooted in in-person engagement. But I think the silver lining is it made us get really creative about how to use other resources to harness social impact, specifically our platform, which is something that we had done work in, but hadn't really invested a ton of effort. And so right now, we're actually working on a project called Twitter for Nonprofits, which essentially empowers any nonprofit anywhere in the world to further their cause through the Twitter service. And so I think that was a really interesting opportunity that COVID provided us. We've also been really leaning into our employee matching program, which is something that was definitely less utilized, I think, pre-COVID. And so that's been an opportunity folks feel very compelled and empowered to give back financially. And so yeah, I think despite the challenges that the pandemic has provided, it's also given us opportunities and room to create and innovate in ways that we may not have thought of before.
Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it completely turned upside down our program. I think we basically in March, we felt that we needed to kind of step in and help. Like the world was in a very dire place, and there was lots of ways that we could have real impact. And so I think we took a bit of time to get a good understanding of, I mean, a little bit of time when we had none, because we were in kind of the very beginning of the pandemic. I think we felt like we had an opportunity to help move essential workers who might not have been able to get to work because public transportation was shut down. We saw a lot of people who were isolated in their homes, especially seniors, folks in school, kids in school who were not getting their school lunches that needed food. And so I think for us, we took a very public stance, and in March, kind of made a commitment to provide 10 million free meals, rides, and deliveries through our platform, through Eats and Rides. And that was all led by my team. I mean, obviously it was an incredible cross-functional effort because that's a lot of things and people and food to move. But I think for us, that just felt like a natural, like we needed to step in some way, but then figuring out exactly what that looked like, we made this commitment, and then we kind of figured out exactly how we were going to be kind of helping in the time of crisis. And so I think that took all of our bandwidth and all of our team's time, and many other people and many other teams. And so I think from there, we were actually, once we hit a bit of I mean, it definitely wasn't a recovery period. We're still in the pandemic, but I think once in the summertime when it felt like, people could go outside and there was like a little bit of a break before the second wave, I think our team took the opportunity to say, okay, that was a crazy 4 months for us because of what we were providing. What are the learnings that we can have from that? And then how could we kind of incorporate it into our plans for the rest of the year and into this year? And I think that was a really good turning point for us because we actually saw the value of doing such a big campaign like that. It really was the first type of campaign that Uber has done before. And now we've even been able to, for the vaccines, like that's like the next step. And so we've made another commitment now to help people get their vaccines. And we had so many learnings from this kind of first phase of moving people to hospitals and getting them food and all of that. But I think the pandemic kind of showed us the value way more than we probably would have been able to predict. Like obviously incredibly unfortunate, but I think that we saw that we had a place to play, and we actually were able to do that.
And so Rachel, let's stay with you for this next question, since you've probably have done this, but so how can you pitch a partial role in social impact? So let's say you have an existing role at a company and you're looking to get into social impact. Like, how do you pitch your executive team around the value of social impact, why your company needs some type of program, and then also how can you actually run that program?
Yeah, I mean, I think pitching it's kind of what I've been saying, like, what is the business case? So what company do you work at? What do you guys do? What are you the experts in? And then where are some of the shortcomings, and where is kind of the business moving? And is there a way that if you had social impact or that whatever you're going to pitch could actually help with getting more profits for the business, or whatever it is that you're trying to do or your executives care about. So I think that's the first piece. I think the second, this is such an annoying quote, and I'm probably not going to quote it right, but don't ask for forgiveness later, or whatever that saying is. Like, just start doing it. If you wait, someone else is going to take that over. If you work in tech, you likely work with others who are entrepreneurial and will take things. And so I think it's take that opportunity if you see it, and kind of just do it. I don't think you should ask for permission. I think that if you can make a business case and then start doing the work, then you can kind of also show the value as you're doing the work.
London, you want to chime in?
I think Rachel hit the nail on the head.
So there are several questions along what I'm about to say. So I definitely want to double click into it. But as it relates to community partners, is there a set criteria your team makes? So that way, obviously you're getting a lot of individuals reaching out to you. If you have a set criteria, you're able to kind of narrow down who's an ideal partner for you, versus having so many people reach out to you and you're trying to appease everybody. Is there a set criteria your team has in place? Let's start with you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's something that we still grapple with, because we get so much inbound from amazing nonprofits and organizations doing really incredible work. I think the biggest thing for us is strategic alignment and mission alignment. I think that's the number one thing we focus on. We don't have like a list of like, these are the 7 things that a partner must have in order to be partner with them. I think it's evaluated on a case by case basis, depending on where we are, like what we're doing, and also the amount of resourcing we have. And so I would say strategic alignment is huge, and kind of where it makes sense for them to fit in at the time of what we're doing. I'm sorry, that's not a super clear answer, but I guess at a high level, that's really how we approach these partnerships. I think if there are opportunities to support partners with low hanging fruit, I think we always try to do that. But with partners that are asking for large commitments like financial grants, or greater like on platform support, it really comes down to a case by case basis. I'd be curious to know what Rachel thinks, because I think a lot of companies approach it differently, and have different areas of focus and different priorities. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. I think we have our general like things that we look for that I've kind of mentioned before. I think it's helpful. And I guess, yeah, I think it's thinking that Uber is global, and we obviously have a big kind of presence in the US. So it's also thinking of like national partners that we can work with. So I think like those are things that we look for. But to London's point, if we hear a story about a nonprofit in San Francisco that we're like, oh my God, like they are a perfect fit, we should work with them, right? Like it kind of, this is an annoying answer, but like I agree, it is kind of a case by case. I think that potentially with companies that have more mature social impact programs, they do have, like, my guess is google.org might have more like criteria that you need to follow. And definitely if you're like applying for a part of a grant program, that's different. Like there is like probably strict criteria, but I think just general partnerships, at least where we're at Uber now, is like, it is a little bit of case by case, but we tend to try to make sure that they focus in, like the issue areas that we care about, can match our scale, could help us with a global or national type of program.
Are there any thought leaders in the social impact space that you recommend people check out?
I can start with this.
Please.
I think kind of I kind of answered this question of like, what social impact things do I like to read? I think it's, for me, I look at the brands that I like, and then I think it is interesting to read through like a letter from the CEO or something that they might have on their website, or some leader at the company that's publicly talking about social impact. Like I think immediately I think of Patagonia, Starbucks, Ben and Jerry's are some really strong leaders outside of tech in social impact. I think they are also companies that are a bit older. And so they've just been around for a while, but I think are still, and I would arguably add Nike potentially to the list. Like I think they've been through the ringer a bit, are more experienced. I think that us newbies in tech might have like some things that we can learn from them. Like they're still very successful companies now with the changing world. And so I think for me, like I'm sure that there's newer thought leaders kind of in the social impact space, but I actually prefer to kind of go back and look at companies that are doing social impact well, that have been doing it well for decades, and look at their leaders and kind of see what they have to say.
I would agree with that. I think companies, I would also plus one to Patagonia and Ben and Jerry's. I think they have a really strong social impact program and always are very bold when they take a stance on issues, which I admire. I also admire companies, and like Rachel said, they're more established and they've been around for much longer and have had time to develop robust programs. But Google is great, Adobe, Autodesk. I think something that I admire about those companies is they have a really strong commitment to transparency, and they have a lot of public disclosures, and it's really cool. You can see their progress over the years and all their goals and their progress towards those goals. And I think that's definitely like the gold star approach and something that I would love Twitter to see moving forward.
Okay, this next question is for Rachel, but London, feel free to chime in. So you mentioned Uber didn't have a formal social impact team when you joined. So what other teams would you recommend people interested in breaking into social impact at companies search for outside of the actual social impact kind of role?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think what I meant by that is, so Uber, when I first joined, was a very decentralized company generally. I think that if you even think about, if you're a consumer of Uber or Uber Eats and you've used it in a different city or market, it does look different. And so I think because the product looks different in every city, and it's like a physical, Uber is like a physical product, right? Like it's not something in the cloud. And so I think we have to be, as a company, we have to be a bit more aware of our like our footprint and our like how we show up in a certain market. And because of that, the company, again, when I joined, was staffed very decentralized. And so I think there were pockets of social impact and employee volunteering kind of happening everywhere. And it like kind of spanned all different teams in what I saw. I think like local marketing had kind of brand impact partnerships that I saw. Definitely folks kind of on our operations side. I saw a lot of kind of interesting hacks in the app around giving back, which I thought was really cool. And then I think also on the employee engagement side. So my team doesn't focus on employee volunteering or employee engagement anymore, but that's how I got into social impact at Uber. So I also think there's a huge opportunity on kind of the employee experience side to add that in.
Yeah, I would just say like social impact looks different at every company. So it's hard to say, to give one blanket answer. But at Twitter, we are deeply intertwined with the public policy team, because a lot of our social impact work also supports our public policy priorities. So that is one, I think, avenue for social impact. As Rachel mentioned, employee engagement piece. Our team manages employee engagement, but we also work very closely with our people experience team. So I think that's another opportunity. Real estate and workplace, they do a lot of the environmental sustainability work. I think there's opportunities to engage in social impact in that world, and then also through inclusion and diversity. They're doing a lot of great work around workforce development and building pipelines to tech. And so that can be an important avenue as well.
Okay, next question. So you mentioned your teams are small. Do you predict the teams at your companies will grow as consumer desire for social responsibility in the companies they associate with grows? Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I were to have an ideal state, I love the size of my team. I know that I've said a few times that it's small and lean, but I think that makes us as a team nimble. I think what would be beneficial is almost people who dedicate 50% of their time on that are housed on other teams to social impact. So if we could have 50% of a bunch of folks on product and engineering, that would be amazing because 50% of their time they're focusing on their day job, they're tuned into where the business is moving, but then their other 50% for social impact can really be informed by what their like quote unquote day job is. And I think that that's critical because you don't want to become too siloed, because I think it's like if we have an engineer or a pure marketer on our team, then they're maybe not as ingrained with what the rest of marketing is doing or the rest of product. And so I think it's that to me would kind of be the sweet spot. I don't know how possible that is. I know that like companies like Google, I think have like 20%, the 20% time program where employees can kind of dedicate 20% of their time to things that they want to do. And I think that that's a really interesting model and potentially could be helpful. So it's not like, I mean, obviously I think we would like a few more heads on the team, but I think growing it to much larger potentially could take away from the value that we're adding.
Yeah, I think Rachel brings up some great points. I would love to see some more folks on our product teams, have dedicated time to work on social impact. I think the hope is that our team will grow. As a company grows, I don't foresee it growing exponentially, but I think we hopefully will bring on some more folks to manage employee engagement, especially as more of my work and our immediate team's work moves on to like social impact on the platform. So I think at a high level, it will grow, but I don't think it will be anything as big as other teams at the company. Which, as Rachel mentioned, it's nice to be nimble and to be lean, and to be able to move really quickly. I know some companies have very large programs, like for example, Facebook. They have 200 or 300 people who are working on social impact, which is definitely not common. And I've heard that it can be more bureaucratic at times. So no shade on Facebook, but just the idea of having a smaller team is really nice for being able to adapt and pivot quickly.
Okay, we're going to take a few more questions. And so this next one here, do you recommend higher education for this field? If so, what would you recommend? A master's in social enterprise, an MBA, etc.? London, how about we start with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like when I look at folks in social impact, I've seen some folks have master degrees in public administration or social impact, and I've also seen some folks who have no higher level education and who have just kind of come to the field with real world experience. So I wouldn't say it's an absolute prerequisite. I think there are a lot of things that you can learn on the job, whether that is working at a nonprofit or even working at a company and volunteering on the side with your social impact team or volunteering on a board. I think there's lots of ways to develop the skills that you need to be successful in social impact. I will say what higher education can do, or executive education in social impact, is sometimes give you more of those finite tools and frameworks for thinking about social impact. One of the reasons I ended up doing my program is that I wanted some more of that tooling to be able to look at social impact more rigorously and to get some frameworks on how I should think about like making change in a company. And so that's all to say, I don't think it's an absolute prerequisite, but I think if you're also very passionate about the subject and you're interested in and you want to learn for the purpose of learning, I think why not? I will know that it is a lot of time and investment, so I think it's important to go into the program knowing what you want out of it before making that commitment.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that. I don't have that experience myself, and so I think I definitely see places where it would add value if I did have that experience. I think kind of what you were saying, London, is if there's like help around thinking of the frameworks or measuring success or like some of the analysis pieces, which I would guess you would learn in a program like that. I think that could be very beneficial. Um, I don't know if it's necessary, and kind of to what you said, London, like if just making sure that it's an investment you personally want to make, not that you're making it because you think it's going to give you a leg up. Because I don't know, it's such a new, I feel like it's such a new program that I hear about popping up at different schools too, that I think that there's a lot of unknowns about it. In 10 years, it probably will look a lot different. Like potentially all social impact jobs, the prerequisite will be to have kind of more formalized education on it. I just think right now, I don't know if we're quite there yet.
When you think about your current team right now, as it relates to their skills, what would you say is needed most in terms of, let's say you wanted to hire a new individual? What type of skills are needed most on your teams? London, how about we start with you?
Yeah, good question. I'll just make a note that um, like not all jobs are made the same. I can't remember if I already touched on this, but there are lots of there's a different nuances within social impact, right? Like uh, a sustainability manager who is in charge of the company's carbon disclosure, right, reporting versus a manager who's running employee engagement. Those are going to be two completely different skill sets, and so I think it's important to understand those nuances when you're going in. Like looking at just my immediate team, I think what's great about it and what makes us effective is we all actually have different skill sets that balance each other out really nicely. Um, our head of philanthropy, who is amazing, most of his job is relationship building. So I think it's really important to have that when you're at the top of the chain, building relationships with high level partners and executives and getting buy-in. I think that's incredibly important. I spend a lot of my time like running programs and executing. So I have to focus a lot on program management and project management. And then my other colleague does a lot of work in managing the BenEvD program and measuring data analysis and the impacts of our programs. And so that requires a different skill set. So I think understanding what role you're applying to and what skills you need for that is important. Is important to know. I hope that answers the question. But yeah, yeah. Sorry, Rachel, let you go.
No, I completely agree. I think it really depends on, I think it's more about kind of spinning, like if you're applying for a job, like what is the kind of value add that you bring? What is the expertise? Because likely the team that you're joining again is a bit smaller. And so I think it's like, how can you complement the strengths or weaknesses that are already kind of present on the team? So I don't know. I mean, I think it really depends. I don't mean to be a broken record on this piece, but I think being able to like help measure, like with the measurement, I think that's an important skill to have. But I think like general, like everyone on my team is like very strong in program management and relationship building. Like I would say those are must-haves, but then everything else is kind of nice to have to see how it kind of complements each other.
Okay, next question. What would you consider some of your successful programs that didn't involve writing a check or a grant? Rachel, how about we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the 10 million free rides, meals, and deliveries that we gave away, I mean, that still involved us spending money, but it's not like we wrote a check to one nonprofit to help disperse that. It was hundreds of partnerships that we had across the world that made that happen. And I think that I think that was a huge success. We moved a lot of people that needed to be moved. We fed a lot of people that needed to be fed. We were really resourceful as a company, kind of in the changing times, to figure out like how as a company we could kind of move, like switch gears to kind of keep up with what was happening in the world. So yeah, I mean, I think that was again, it did involve money, but it also involved a lot of creativity and kind of working with what we had in kind on our end. Um, I mean, I think I think there's value in check writing 100%. But if you want to achieve true social impact, I think it has to be a program that you're building along with some money that you're spending. But it's really like the program will be there for the longer term where the money kind of runs out. So I think it's like anywhere that you can think about, how are you not just focusing around what you're writing, check writing.
Yeah, I would say projects around in kind have been really successful for us, specifically around how we've used our platform. So, two big initiatives. One we call Campaigns for Change, where we essentially partner with a nonprofit around an area of focus, and we launch a major campaign in partnership with our Twitter Next team, which is basically a creative strategy who work with the biggest brands in the world. And so they partner with this nonprofit and we run a massive campaign. We recently did one with the NAACP LDF Fund for voter suppression. We've done some for Earth Day. We did one in the UK about media literacy and digital safety. So I think that has been a really interesting initiative. We also recently piloted a program called Powered by Tweets, which is also an interesting take on sparking conversation on Twitter and launching campaigns where actually it's a global competition of creative agencies where they pitch social impact campaigns on behalf of a nonprofit partner. And then the winner is selected, provided advertising credits, and then they launch the campaign on Twitter. So those are two pretty successful initiatives that we've done that don't involve the traditional writing grants kind of thing.
Okay, we're going to end on this question. So we all know the value of social impact and how valuable it is for a company to participate. However, at global companies, it's still difficult to create and integrate a CSR program. The question is, why is that? Why is it so difficult for companies to actually launch a program? Is it that it's not a priority, or is there something else, in your opinion? London, how about we start with you?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, Jeremy, you have some really great questions tonight that are making me think.
It's the audience.
Oh, the audience. Great questions, audience. I would actually say like now compared to 10 years ago, it's a lot easier to get buy-in for a social impact program and build it in because I think the business case is so much stronger these days. And there's so much more academic research that shows social impact contributing to a bottom line. But I think at a very high like societal level, it's challenging because like we live in a capitalistic society and we live in an economy that hasn't necessarily prioritized the triple bottom line, right? Businesses are focused on making money and the main stakeholders are their shareholders or investors. And so it's this ultimate way of understanding and viewing business and its relationship with society that I think needs to shift in order for social impact to become really successful and mainstream and easy to implement. And I think the good news is that it's happening right now. And I think the trend is underway. I think, you know, beyond that, other challenges are like, especially at companies that are already established, like they have systems and processes in place. And sometimes it's hard to break through that. And it's hard to break through that noise and it's hard to break through the hundreds of priorities that the company has, right? And so I think that's a challenge. I think culture can also be a challenge for some companies as well, right? The idea of giving back may not have been integrated into a company's DNA. And so bringing that to a company that has already been around for 20 plus years can take time, right? It's a completely different shift in how a company views its purpose in society and how employees also view their role at work. And so I think those are some challenges as to why it's hard, but I am really hopeful I mean, if you look on LinkedIn, you'll see so many more social impact roles than you would have seen 10 years ago, by far. And so I think that's really exciting. And I think companies and employees and customers and political leaders are really demanding that businesses step up and they take a stance on important social issues, and they are intentional and thoughtful about how they impact society.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said. I think there's kind of one piece that I actually think about a lot, and I think I feel like we have many people or leaders that think government should play a certain role as the safety security net for many people. And there's a difference between what people think government should do and what government is actually doing. And I think right now, my fear is that sometimes people look to corporations, in my opinion, to fix problems that potentially government programs, if they were run effectively, would serve. And so I think that's a balance that I think is something that we are kind of in the midst of figuring out, because I do think corporations have a clear role. Obviously, I work in social impact, have a clear role to have a strong social impact. But at the end of the day, corporations will always be corporations. And so they are going to be driven by other things. Whereas I don't want social impact to go so far where it does take the burden off of government programs that I think are there to help people and to be a safety net. And so I think I'm honestly curious to kind of, with the changing administration, to see how and if things change. So I think that's part of it. But I also think kind of what you were saying, London, social impact for me has changed dramatically just in the past couple of years. Like when I go on LinkedIn now, there's so many social impact roles. And I feel like startups that start now versus 5 years ago, they have like social impact will be built into what they do versus a company from 5 years ago, maybe not. And so I think for that piece, I do feel hopeful, but it's also like, we can't necessarily holistically have the conversation around social impact without thinking of some of the factors that you mentioned, but then also the role that government, I believe, should also play.
All right, London, Rachel, thank you so much for allowing me to pepper you with a lot of questions. And for all the attendees, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all the questions on your end. And we will see you next time. Be on the lookout for another event. We have one coming up in March, so more information will be sent out later on. All right, have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.